Thank you for joining us for the final session. Uh, we welcome you as we continue to commemorate our ancestors and our history. I hope that you have enjoyed the conversations and the presentations that have been made during this month. For any that you have missed or you would like to hear again, there are links to both our Facebook recording and YouTube. I've learned a lot during this month about the Amistad's history and ways in which it has been shared and promoted. And in this last session, we will address specifically how communities in Connecticut have connected and linked to this historical event.
I too would like to thank you for joining us for this last and very important session of our Black History Month series that has focused on the Amistad. As Anne said, we have learned so much from our previous guests, Captain Pinkney, Marcus Rediker, and Corey Walker, and we are looking forward to the discussion today about how this history is being incorporated in the narrative of the state of Connecticut. We have decided to begin this session with our pledge of remembrance that we instituted during our 10th anniversary celebration in August of 2021. Kala Blackburn will lead the pledge, and then we will turn the program over to our moderator, Michelle Dingle, who will introduce the panelists and begin the discussion. Thank you again for your interest, for your encouragement, and for your support.
I pledge to remember and honor those who came before me. I will cherish their lives, their sacrifices, and the lessons I have learned. I will practice the values transmitted to me from my ancestors and my community to the best of my ability in order to acknowledge and sustain our humanity for today and create a better world for future generations.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project's February 2022 Black History Month series. I am Michelle Dingle, and I'm excited to be serving as your moderator today. This program will be closed captioned for your viewer experience. During this panel and exchange, which by the way is the final in this Black History Month series, we will explore ways in which 3 locations in Connecticut have brought the Amistad history into present day. Middletown, New Haven, and New London each have separate and unique connections to the Amistad. New London as the arrival location, New Haven as the trial site spanning 2 years, and Middletown as a Middle Passage arrival location. How their communities promote and address this event and its legacy are the topics for this session. So it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists. I'm going to start with Charles E. Warner, Jr. Charles is a native of New Haven, Connecticut, a graduate of Morehouse College. He is currently employed with the New Haven Public Schools, serving as a district behavior specialist with the responsibilities of educating students and supporting schools and teachers in the areas of social and emotional learning. Inspired by his love for history, he is also the chairman of the Connecticut Freedom Trail, a member of the board of directors of the Amistad Committee and the International Festival of Arts and Ideas, the advisory board of Uncovering New Haven, the Yale and Slavery Working Group, as well as chairman of the Dixwell Congregation Church History Committee. Welcome, Charles. Next, I would like to introduce Laura Natusch. Since April 2017, Laura has been executive director of New London Landmarks, an organization that works to preserve and promote New London's historic character through education, advocacy, and the rehabilitation of historic structures. She has served as the City of New London's Chief Administrative Officer and on the Personnel Board. As a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, she also has taught art history at Mitchell College. Her volunteer work encompasses numerous political and civics-based campaigns. And next is Deborah Shapiro. Debbie received her Juris Doctor from the University of Connecticut in 1976. In 2009, she semi-retired from the practice of law to assume the position of Executive Director of the Middlesex County Historical Society. Her last project there was to guide the mounting of the national award-winning exhibit, A Vanished Port, Middletown and the Caribbean, 1750 to 1824. The story of Middletown's role in the West Indies sugar and slave trades. At the beginning of 2019, Debbie was appointed the municipal historian for the city of Middletown. In that capacity, she successfully applied to UNESCO to have Middletown designated as a site of memory. Thank you all for being here today. I hope you're ready for some great conversation. Feel free to answer any of these questions and add on to any part of the conversation. But before we get started, is there anything else that anyone would like to add to their intro?
Well, I would like to add a little something. A story from my youth. I grew up in Ohio and on a farm, and one time in my youth, when I was a teenager, my uncle who lived in Washington picked up my cousins and myself, brought us to Washington, turned us loose on the mall every morning on his way to work, and said, "Be at this corner at 5 o'clock." And we were just cousins, just delighted to be going to all of the Smithsonian museums all on our own. But then on the way home to get back to Ohio, we stopped at Harper's Ferry so that we could see where John Brown's raid was. And then to get back to the Pennsylvania Turnpike, you had to go up through the panhandle of Maryland. And this was before the days of McDonald's or any fast food. There were just mom and pops on the side of the road. So we pulled into one and we walked in, and there was this huge sign that said, "We do not serve coloreds." And I have to tell you, growing up in Ohio, I had never seen such a thing. And I was so shocked. And to this day, I can not only picture that sign, but I can picture exactly what that restaurant looked like. And
Wow.
That experience has really informed my work that I've done in racial justice here in Middletown. But I think it's something that most people in the North never got to experience. So they don't quite understand what Jim Crow was. I saw it on the TV, but it didn't hit me the way walking into that restaurant and seeing that sign did. And I really wish that everybody in this country had an experience like that. And maybe we wouldn't be in the state that we're in right now. But
wow, that's powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I would agree that is, when you see something like that, that can be life altering. And so I am super happy to have you here, as well as Charles and Laura. We are about to get into this conversation. Are you all ready? We've got some questions. I'm going to toss them out to you all. Feel free to answer and have a hearty conversation around all things Amistad and what you all are involved in around that within your state. Okay, you all ready to start?
Yes, absolutely.
Charles, you seem to be very excited, so I might start off with you with this question.
Sure.
All right, what is your city's connection to the Amistad historically?
Well, I'm from New Haven, and New Haven was the site of not only the place where the Amistad captives were jailed, but New Haven was also the site where some of the trials took place to help to free the Amistad captives. Many of the folks who were early political leaders and kind of deemed founding fathers or important people in New Haven's history were active in the issues surrounding the Amistad captives, whether on the side of making sure that these adults and children were freed, or making sure that they did whatever they could to support a pro-slavery attitude. And we even had New Haven families, attorneys who represented the Spanish crown as part of the trial. So the Amistad Incident was definitely a very huge part of a national story, but this was house to house, neighbor to neighbor, friend to friend at the time of the incident in New Haven.
Okay, thank you. Deborah, Debbie.
Oh,
I'm going to call you Debbie, if you don't mind.
Middletown does not have a direct connection to the Amistad incident, but we are connected to Amistad and to its commemoration as part of the larger story of Connecticut's connections to slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and its abolition. And I would also say that because Middletown is on the Connecticut River, and it was a major port during the West Indies sugar and slave trade, that we played a central role in as being a transportation channel for many Connecticut communities and for the larger Atlantic world.
Okay, great. And Laura?
So the Amistad showed up in New London before before the Amistad captives ended up in New Haven. In the summer of 1839, after the captives successfully rebelled and took control of the Amistad, they found themselves off the shore of Long Island. And at that point, a US Navy vessel, the Washington, showed up, took control again of the Amistad. The Africans were captives again, and the Washington towed the Amistad to New London. The captives were only in New London for a few days, but a lot happened during those few days. As Marcus Rediker, one of your prior lecturers, points out in his book on the Amistad Rebellion, three important things happened. The first was artists showed up and drew the Amistad captives, and they did not draw them as savages, as murderous, irrational people, nor did they draw them as weak people deserving white people's sympathy. The artists drew the Amistad captives as strong, courageous leaders. And those images were widely disseminated, and they helped build public support for the Amistad captives. The second thing that happened was a newspaper reporter for the New York Sun showed up, and he wrote a very sympathetic story, which was republished in numerous papers. And same thing, it presented the Amistad captives as leaders, as heroes, instead of murderous pirates. And then the third thing that happened was a local abolitionist, Dwight James, a grocer, visited both the Amistad and the Washington, and he gleaned during those visits that, contrary to what the ship's papers said, the Amistad captives were not Spanish subjects. They had been recently kidnapped from Africa, and he understood that this was in violation of international treaties. And he understood, this grocer formulated in his head really the legal argument that ultimately proved successful. And he quickly mobilized abolitionists, prominent abolitionists, and he explained that they were going to need to find somebody who could translate so that the Africans could tell their own story in their own words. And I don't know what would have happened if he had not shown up. Yeah. One other thing happened. A judge from New Haven showed up. He was an avowed white supremacist. He had led the charge against Prudence Crandall's school for Black girls. He did a judicial investigation, and he was the person who first decided that the Amistad captives should be charged with murder and with piracy. And the day after his visit, they were transported to be jailed in New Haven.
Wow. Thank you all for that answer and filling us all in on this history, right? The next question I have for you all presently: how has your city interpreted or demonstrated the Amistad Connection? For example, events or programs that are happening. Charles, I'm going to throw back to you.
Sure. In 1988, two congregational church pastors in the city, one from New Haven's oldest church, the First Congregational Church, also known as Center Church on the Green. Their pastor, the Reverend Peter Ives, along with the pastor of one of the country's oldest African-American congregational churches, the Dixwell Congregational Church, pastored at that time by the Reverend Edwin Edmonds. The two pastors came together wanting to commemorate the Amistad Incident. And so they went to a well-known activist and community educator by the name of Alfred Martyr. And they said, we need to tell the story and really make the city understand that this story is ours, and we have a duty to not only embrace the story, but to share the many stories connected to the Amistad Incident. And so what these men did with Al Martyr at the helm was to reconstitute the Amistad Committee that existed at the time of the original Amistad Incident. And so in 1988, the Amistad Committee got together to celebrate the story and to tell the story, and the committee has been going strong to this very day. Out of the Amistad Committee forming in 1988, the Connecticut Freedom Trail was created, and that really helped rally historical sites and institutions around the state to get behind honoring and recording and sharing the Connecticut's history with the institution of slavery, with the movement of abolition. And one of the major pieces that linked all these small towns and cities across the state was the story of the Amistad Incident. And so in the early 90s, we decided that New Haven needed a piece of public art to always keep the story of the Amistad Incident in the forefront of the city's mind and the world's mind. And so we struck out to build a statue, and that was sculpted by Louisville's Ed Hamilton.
Thank you.
It's important, and this is one of the reasons I don't want to forget this. Many folks cite the Amistad Incident as the first international human rights incident. Mm-hmm. And so the establishment of public art, the statue of Senke, who was known to be the leader of the Amistad captives, was to always keep in mind the struggle for human rights.
That's wonderful. Debbie.
Well, in the late 1990s, our historical society did an African-American trolley tour. And what that was a series of plays that at each spot, and the people who came on the tour had a narrator on the trolley, and then when they got to each of the venues, they would get off and see one of the plays. And so one of the plays was an abolitionist meeting and how it was attacked by the mob. Another was on our green where our Civil War monument is. And so it was a celebration of Civil War soldiers, the African-American Civil War soldiers. And another spot was up at Wesleyan, where a student was educating one of the Black students and then was forbidden to do that. So then in 2000, when the Amistad replica first came to Middletown, we were able to jump right back into action and put on the plays again. The city of Middletown just welcomed the ship wholeheartedly. We had, I think, 3,800 people tour the ship in one day. And we had all of these other events that surrounded the Amistad. So we've tried very hard to bring that to the fore. And the Amistad was just back in Middletown again in October. And we had a series of events then as well.
Okay, thank you. Laura.
So in New London, we have the Custom House Maritime Museum, and it is very near where the Amistad was actually docked. And they have a permanent exhibit all about the Amistad. So that's probably the largest thing that we do to make that history visible. But we also did just launch a 15-site Black Heritage Trail, and Amistad Pier is one of those sites, and we tell the story of the Amistad on that plaque, and then there's a QR code that leads you to a larger story. And there's also a plaque about the Amistad right in front of the Custom House Maritime Museum.
Okay. Next question for the panelists. Is this history included in your city school curriculum? And if so, how is it included? Who wants to take this one first? Charles, would you like to do it?
Sure, I don't mind. Yes, the Amistad, the story of the Amistad Incident is definitely a part of our city's school curriculum, but that is because it's also part of the state's curriculum. The Amistad Committee, the Connecticut Freedom Trail, and other entities have made sure to make history and social studies relevant and personal to the citizens of the state. And so, you know, we have really drawn on Connecticut's rich history to educate young people, and certainly the story of the Amistad Incident would be at the very top of, you know, subject matter that we would use to teach about history and social studies to students throughout Connecticut. Also, we have plenty of wonderful colleges and universities who use their education departments to help bolster curriculum across the state. Yale has a Teachers Institute where public school teachers study, research, and then write units to teach school students. And so the Amistad Incident and surrounding events usually is at the center of much of the research that public school teachers have done.
Laura, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that in New London, every third grader has a field trip to the Custom House Maritime Museum in order to see the exhibit about the Amistad. It is also taught in the Regional Multicultural Magnet School, and we have a summer camp that's run by some by the Hempstead houses, and they always cover that Amistad story too.
Great, that's great.
In Middletown, we had a family, the Beeman family. The father, Caesar Beeman, received his freedom when he fought in the Revolutionary War for his master. And instead of taking his master's name, he made his own name, Be a Man. And so it is Beeman. And his son Jehiel came to Middletown and became the minister of the Cross Street AME Zion Church in the 1830s. And this family was very active in the abolitionist movement. And Jehiel was one of the co-founders of the Middletown Anti-Slavery Society. And his daughter-in-law was Clarissa Beeman, and she was one of the founders of the Colored Female Anti-Slavery Society, only the second such society in the country. One of the sons, Amos Beeman, went on to become a famous minister down in New Haven. And another son, Leverett Beeman, purchased land and subdivided it into lots and sold it to free blacks this is in the 1840s. And it was one of the very first planned communities for free African Americans in the country. So now we just built a new middle school, and it has been named the Beeman Middle School after this family. And so there is extensive curriculum about the Beemans and abolition in our 6th, 7th, and 8th grade school. So I'm hoping that they will also be including the Amistad in that. But it's something that schools across the country can find something that happened in their community to African Americans and incorporate that in their curriculum.
Wow, that's amazing. I think that's really great that this information is still being dispersed out there, you know, despite all of the stuff that's going on in the news that we know of now about trying to restrict a lot of this information. I think it's really great that there are some places where this information is still being told and still being taught. So thank you all for giving me that insight. I'm going to move on to the next question that we have. What effects are being made to encourage the inclusion of young people in telling this story? We'd like to take that.
Well, here in New Haven, through the Amistad Committee, which is still going, like I said, since 1988, the Amistad Committee is committed itself recently to restructuring itself and looking at ways in which we connect with the community. And one of the things that we targeted was reaching out to youth and getting them to learn the stories, but also not only learn the stories, be able to share and tell stories, because that would make them excited, but also makes them a part of the efforts to do everything from teach to bolster tourism, community pride. And so we are currently underway with working on a program that would not only train young people in the historical information, including the Homicide Incident, which is like a huge New Haven story, but also in actually being available to share the stories with the public.
Yeah. Well, we included youth quite extensively in our Middle Passage ceremony. The first one that we had, where we unveiled our marker, we created these placards that had the names of the West African countries that the enslaved people were captured in. And so there was one with the colonial name and then one with the modern name, so that people would know the history behind that. And then another set of youth, they came from the community at large and from various churches and the NAACP Youth Council. The next set of kids came up with the names of enslaved Africans from Middletown, and also names of people who were active in the abolitionist movement. So every year, well, we've had 3 ceremonies now, and every year we include young people in some fashion. They also were the first ones to put flowers into the Connecticut River. So with the hopes that the flowers would make it out into open waters where people had been thrown overboard during the Middle Passage.
And just out of curiosity, Debbie, when you all were working on getting that marker up,
Yeah.
was there any resistance to that?
No.
Or were you welcomed with open arms? Because I know that in certain places that, you know, it's a reminder of history that's not always so pretty, right? It's a lot of people don't want to be reminded of that. So I was just wondering if you came across any type of resistance, or were they just like, absolutely, this is a great thing to do?
Not at all. In fact, I went to the city council and I asked them for the money to pay for it. And they paid for it without any qualms at all. And they were quite enthusiastic. So
I think that's great. I think that's really good to hear.
yeah, and the committee that we put together, it was a cross section of the community. I had a Native American, well, I was the chairman of the committee, so that's why I say I, but had a Native American on the committee who gave the permission to proceed. We had people from the various African churches, African American churches in town, and other people who were movers and shakers that I knew would help me get things done. And when we went to the city council, there was they just said sure and signed a check. So that was really good.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. Has there been any attempt at the state level to incorporate Amistad history into the standard local narrative? And if so, how have you or your organization been involved in that?
Sure. At the state level, the Connecticut Freedom Trail, which is a statewide organization that consists of currently 160 sites related to slavery, abolition, and the 20th century contributions of African Americans in Connecticut. The Freedom Trail has definitely told the story as individual sites, but also as a unit. We have a longstanding program bringing the Freedom Trail to life through the arts, which tells stories. Certainly many of them are related to the Amistad Incident. We also have a replica Amistad schooner, which currently is docked and sails around to different places, not only in Connecticut, but throughout the United States and across the Atlantic Ocean. Has made its way to Sierra Leone and to England as well. But the Connecticut legislature assumes some financial responsibility for the maintenance of that replica schooner. So the Amistad is able to sail because the state of Connecticut saw the value in having this ship literally available for the world to see and to hear the story of the Amistad Incident. And again, that's the Connecticut legislature that helps to finance the existence of that ship.
Okay, Laura, Debbie, anything on that you can contribute or that you know of that's happening
Sure.
at that level?
Sure. The City of New London got a tourism grant that was funded, the state funded, and we have used that in part to put together a 15-site Black Heritage Trail. And I'm one of the 4 researchers that did put that together. And so we have used state money to tell the Amistad story in that way.
We have a number of Heritage Trail signs, the state one in Middletown. And we also have our own Heritage Trail that winds around the downtown area. And some of them are highlight African American spots, in addition to the State Freedom Trail. And the Beeman Triangle, that African American community, that is on the state register of historic places. And in fact, we're going to the city council this next week to try to get funding to try to put it on the national register. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that one.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, next question. What has been your community's response to the inclusion of Amistad history into the standard local narrative?
In New Haven, the community has taken that initial sort of that initial announcement about the importance of commemorating that Amistad the milestone of the Amistad Incident back in 1988, and they really embraced the story, and it's become very much so a huge part of New Haven's identity as the home of the Amistad, and it's still very much a part of who we are. Over the years, not only has the city financed the building of a statue to the memory of Sinkay and the Amistad captives, organizations have put up grave markers for those Amistad captives that perished here. Also, there is a local charter school named after the Amistad School here in the city. And then also many of the churches tell the story of the Amistad Incident, particularly the Congregational Church, United Church of Christ, which has instituted a Sunday devoted to the story of the Amistad Incident, having Amistad Sunday in March.
Laura, I'm going to toss that to you.
New London's been very supportive. Like New Haven, it is part of our identity. We are always overjoyed when the Amistad replica comes for a visit. The fact that all of these school children go and see the exhibit tells you how meaningful this is to us. But also we tell the story in the larger context of New London's role in the transatlantic slave trade and how much of our economy was based on that. New London had a large percentage of their population was enslaved, more so than in other New England places. And we don't shy away from telling that history either.
Okay. Debbie?
Yes. In 1776, Middletown's population was 5,037, and 201 of them were Black, most of them enslaved. And this is something that when we had the Vanished Port exhibit, we really stressed and showed that Middletown's economy was really a slave-based economy, because Connecticut agricultural produce was put on the ships here, and they sailed down to the sugar islands of the West Indies and returned with sugar, molasses, rum, and enslaved people. The planters down there kept their acreage in sugarcane because it was so lucrative. And so they had to import all of the food that they had to feed their enslaved workers and themselves. So that's why Connecticut in general and Middletown thrived. Horses, tens of thousands of horses were sent to the Caribbean. So, and most of them came from Connecticut. So this history is something that we have brought out in our town, and it has really been embraced, if that's the word you want to use, that people acknowledge it, and they don't shy away from it, and they use it to try to make Middletown a better place to live now.
Great. Okay. I want to hear in your own words, why is the inclusion of Amistad history important to your community? Why do you think this is so important?
You know, I'm very lucky as executive director of New London Landmarks to hear from so many members of our community what telling both the Amistad history and the larger local Black history means to them. And what I have heard repeatedly, particularly from adult Black residents of New London, is that when they were growing up, they didn't learn much of this history. I know of one person who now lives in Minnesota and is a donor to us. And he says he would have never left New London if he had felt tied to New London as a child by seeing his own history reflected in the narratives that we celebrated. And because he did not see himself represented in those histories, he really didn't think anything about leaving New London. But now coming back and learning the stories that are embedded in New London about local Black history, he's like, why didn't I know? And there's a young former Black city councilor, Curtis Goodwin, who has said repeatedly in public speeches and to me personally, that coming up through New London's public school system, if he heard anything about local Black history, it had to do with enslavement, and it portrayed the enslaved strictly as victims. But the Amistad story is different, because the Amistad story is about resistance and courage and resilience and persistence. So that's a more uplifting and inspiring story and it means a lot to him and to many people in our community to hear that. Then I will also say that New London is a diverse and multicultural city. So of course, everybody deserves the opportunity to see themselves reflected in the stories that we told. But even if we were not that, if we were 99.9% white, it is still a story about human rights, and that's important to everyone, everywhere.
Absolutely, absolutely. Debbie, in your own words, why is this so important?
I'm not sure I can follow that. That's so eloquent, Laura, because it is a matter of everyone seeing themselves in history, in a story that they can relate to, and have other people see their neighbors' stories. And I think that's what's not happening today, is that people aren't seeing their neighbors' stories. And that's what's causing the divisiveness in our country now. And so if more people would see the story of the Amistad or other African-American stories in their community, I think they would be much more understanding of what the group has gone through. But then everybody needs to see themselves somewhere in their community. So I think that was a very good point that you made, Laura.
And do you think it's also not just the lack of not seeing that's causing the divisiveness, but do you think there's a lack of empathy around it also? Or do you think it's just strictly that people just don't want to touch a subject like this, right? Anyone can answer that.
The Amistad incident has not been a taboo subject. It's been a part. It's been a part of the local history, state history, since the incident happened. And then with this sort of like revivified interest since the late 1980s, and then this sort of connecting spirit around the story of the Amistad incident in Connecticut. It's something that the state has always touted and held up as something to be remembered, honored, and shared and taught to the next generations. I think the importance of telling the Amistad story is not only that it teaches, people who are marginalized according to history, that they do matter, that they do have a place and have made an active contribution to the struggle for human rights and freedom, but it also really shows, to me, one of the best examples of what New Haven residents and nutmeggers in the state of Connecticut and citizens of the United States can really do when we work together for a cause we really believe in. The story of the Amistad incident was the story of white abolitionists and politicians and activists, alongside certainly the strength of the African captives and Black citizens who were here in the United States at the time the incident happened, working together to stand up for what was right, that these captives should be free and allowed to return to their homeland. And so you have these differences, racial, religious, cultural, it happened along class lines, but those barriers were removed to fight for the freedom of the Amistad captives. And to me, that's a story that we can always tell. We can remove that which separates us in order to do something that we know is morally upright and correct. And it's really a roadmap for how we should be handling any kind of incident that arises in the future that looks to rob people of their freedom and humanity.
Great. So I know we're running out of time, but I do have one last question for the panelists, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. But this one's I think it's a very important question as well. So beyond the Amistad, what other activities during the last 5 years have advanced African-American history in your city?
Well, I can answer that one.
For it.
Our director now with the Historical Society, Dr. Jesse Nasta, is also a professor at Wesleyan, and he teaches a course called Black Middletown Lives. And they study the earlier years of African-American presence in Middletown. And the students go to the cemetery where African-Americans were buried in the back, of course, in those days, in the early 1800s. And they take individual people and learn about them, and that information then is disseminated throughout the town. We also have in Middletown an official task force of the city called the Anti-Racism Task Force. We also have a racial justice coalition, and the First Congregational Church also has a racial justice team. And so all of these groups are working together to advance racial justice and equality. So I think our community really could be a model community for others across the country in the way we are all working together to try to achieve racial justice.
Okay. Laura?
Yeah, in New London, there has been a real effort by both our municipal government and by local nonprofits to highlight Black history. For example, New London Landmarks, where I work, in recent years has hosted a program on Black whalers. On Ichabod Pease, a man who was born into slavery in 1755 and who went on to open a school for New London's Black children when he was 81 years old. New London even named February 28th Ichabod Pease Day after that program. We collaborated with Connecticut Fair Housing on a program about a largely Black neighborhood which was demolished during the urban renewal era. For that program, we conducted oral histories of people who had been displaced, and we also took a look at the policies that made that neighborhood so vulnerable to demolition. The Hempstead houses have been highlighting the life of Adam Jackson, who was enslaved by Joshua Hempstead at that site in the 1700s. A local researcher, Tom Shook, has been giving tours of New London's Green Book sites. And then most recently, the City of New London collaborated with New London Landmarks on a 15-site Black Heritage Trail. I know I've mentioned it before in this talk, but we're very excited about it. The earliest of these sites is where Robert Jacklin, a Black man, purchased property in the early 1700s against the objections of the town leaders. And the most recent of these sites is the longtime home of Spencer Lancaster, who is still alive and beloved in New London. And he was New London's first Black elected official. And then the other sites mostly tie into larger national stories about the Great Migration, about the golden age of Black banking, about the racial violence of 1919, about the history of Black churches and Black fraternal organizations. And I would tell anybody who is thinking about developing a Black history trail like New London's to look at those national stories and see if you have sites that might tie into them. Maybe you only have one or two sites, or maybe even no sites that on their own would have national importance, but these are a gateway to talk about America's Black history. Our Black History Trail has been extremely well received, so it's something I would encourage anybody to undertake.
Thank you. Charles, I'm going to let you wrap up this question for us.
Sure. In New Haven, over the last 5 years, we've had some significant political elections happen where African Americans and African American women were elected to positions that they had not served in ever before in the history of the city. We've also had the young people who really took on speaking for themselves and advocating and saying that they didn't see themselves represented enough in Latino and African American students speaking up. And so they got together. It's a group called Students for Educational Justice, who pushed to make sure that African Americans and Latinos were forcefully making their way into the history curriculum in the state. And they even got a law change through the Connecticut legislature. We also in New Haven had the erection of a statue to the memory of William Lanson, who was a pioneering New Haven citizen, an outstanding African-American engineer, businessman, and civil rights activist in his day. And so we've also have 2 churches in New Haven that celebrated 200 years in the last 5 years. And that's 200 years of history and achievement and accomplishment and community service. So we are continuing to tell many of the untold stories here in New Haven.
Well, thank you. Charles, Debbie, Laura, thank you for your insights and for your participation in this panel discussion. I think it went really well. I learned a lot from it. I'm sure that the people that are listening and tuning in are learning just as much or have learned just as much. So thank you to everyone that has joined us today. If you have any questions or comments regarding this conversation, please send us an email to middlepassagemarkers@gmail.com and someone will respond. Thank you to all of our supporters, to the board, again, to the panelists, and to Nick Huster, our creative consultant, for putting this program together. For those who would like to donate, you can do so through PayPal or Network for Good. The links to both of those are on our website, middlepassageproject.org, or you can mail your donation to Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. That address is P.O. Box 3071, and that's in Jacksonville, Florida. The zip code is 32206. And for those who like to shop on Amazon like me, you can also donate through the Amazon Smile Foundation. Amazon Smile is a program that donates a percentage of your eligible Amazon purchases to a charity of your choice. So all you have to do is go to amazon.smile.com, link up Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project as your charity, and then just start shopping. To the panelists, thank you again. And everyone, please have a great day.